a time to question. There is a time for answers. There is a time to challenge. There is a time to speculate. There is a time for change. There is a time for truth. The time is now. Welcome to Night Fright, your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. And now your host, Brent Holland.
Showtime! Welcome to the show. I'm excited tonight, folks. Welcome to Night Fright. I'm your host, Brent Holland. Get a pen and paper. I'm going to give you my Skype address because you're going to want to call our two incredible guests tonight. Not one, but two. That's right. Dr. CYRIL WECHT, Donna Kaufman as well. Now, let me just read this about Mr. WECHT because most of the fans of this show will certainly know who he is, and Donna as well. But I'm going to read this very quickly anyways. Dr. CYRIL WECHT is the world's best-known medical examiner. Indeed he is. You've seen him everywhere, folks. You've seen him on Larry King. You've seen him on CNN, ABC, CBS, CTV. CTV is the Canadian one, by the way, folks. You've seen him everywhere in the world. He is virtually the icon for medical examiners. Donna Kaufman, you will know this person as well. She's written for Saturday Night Live, Arsenio Hall, Leno, Letterman. You know, if I go on all night with all these two guys' accomplishments, we will never get to a show. She's also a documentarian, and she wrote groundbreaking work on the OJ Simpson trial, which we'll get to tonight. They both have put a new book out. They came together, folks, and they've got a great new book out. The book is called Final Exams, True Crime Cases from CYRIL WECHT. I'd like to welcome you both to the show. Now, folks, through the wonderful internet, we're able to bring Dr. CYRIL WECHT from Pittsburgh and Donna all the way from California for your listening pleasure. Now, how great is that? Welcome to both of you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, and thanks for inviting us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Donna. What part of California are you in, Donna?
I'm in Los Angeles.
Oh, show off.
We're having a heat wave. Finally, our summer is here.
Okay, now, you know, you're going to have to tell me your address because we've got 35 million Canadians that aren't going through a heat wave right now.
Yeah, come on over.
Start the barbecue. Trust me, Canadians will bring the beer. All right, can we start off? I want to go in a little bit of a different direction. And Dr. WECHT, Michael Brown, what can the forensics tell us about what happened there that we don't already know?
Well, there are some things to be gathered, of course, from the anatomic location of the gunshot wounds. The 4 on the arms, one has to be careful with. While it was initially stated by Dr. Bodden, or at least so interpreted by the news media, that the shots had been fired with Michael Brown facing the police officer. While I don't dispute that as a real possibility, it can't be stated with any degree of certainty. The arms move in a variety of ways. While I'm talking, for example, Brett, move your arm straight up in the air, move it to the right, move it across to your left shoulder, reach in the back for your wallet, reach it down to tie your shoelace, do anything that you want. So you see palm out, palm up, which is the anatomic position of the arm. One can't be certain about that. With regard to the 2 shots in the face and head, they do tell us something. Number one, a shot to the top of the head of a 6'4" guy like Michael Brown can only have been fired from somebody who was in a standing position, unless that person is a 7.5-foot giant. That Michael Brown had to have been facing down. That his head had to be essentially in a 90-degree position, bent at the waist. Likewise, the second shot They went in near the right eye, traveled straight downward, perpendicular to the ground, if you picture yourself standing up, and exiting from below the mandible, the lower jaw, and then re-entering the chest above the clavicle, the collarbone, and going into the chest. Now, that's not possible, is it, if you've got somebody standing up? But if you have him bending down 90 degrees, if you have the top part of his body essentially parallel to the earth, then you can see how those shots would have been fired. So that leaves you with one or two possibilities. Either he was falling because presumably he was shot, or ducking, juking, trying to avoid more gunfire, or he was bent down like a raging bull charging the police officer when the officer shot. So those are the things we can learn from the gunshot wounds. They were all fired from a distance, so that doesn't help us. By that I mean beyond 18, 24 inches with a handgun. You don't see gunpowder residue, and you don't see stippling. Those are little black dots from the carbonaceous material that comes out of the muzzle and goes onto the skin and produces these tiny superficial burns. We don't know, at least I haven't heard, about the shot that, according to the officer, was fired in the car. Now, there should have been gunpowder residue found there on some fabric, on some part of the seat, because that shot, whoever fired it, whether the cop fired it or Michael Brown fired it or it was fired in the struggle for the gun, doesn't make any difference. The point is that that shot would have been fired at a distance of less than 18 inches onto whatever object in the car. Some part of the front seat, presumably, would show that. And I don't know the results of that testing. One other thing we don't know that could help a lot is where were the casings found, from what point were the bullets fired. And we have come to learn, based upon an audio tape, which I think has been tested, checked out to be valid, that there were 9 or 10 shots fired. 6 struck Michael Brown. We know that. Everybody seems to agree on that. And that means 3, some people say 10 shots, but let's say 3 others were fired that did not strike him. What was the position of the officer when those shots were fired? What was the position of Michael Brown's body? We don't know exactly those numbers, at least I don't. And then you get into some other questions about blood spatter pattern, because nobody came to see the body, as I understand it, at least in terms of trained forensic scientists, criminalist forensic pathologists. For about 4 hours, the body was lying there. And that makes changes, too, in terms of the blood spatter pattern, etc. So we know something, but there's a lot we don't know.
Folks, Dr. CYRIL WECHT is joining us tonight with his co-author, Donna Kaufman. Donna's in Los Angeles. Lucky. Dr. WECHT is in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. How's the weather in Pittsburgh today, my friend?
Good, nice. It goes down into the mid-low 40s at night the last few days, but each day has been sunny in the high 60s or 70s. So we're having a decent fall.
Okay, so you'll have to give your address out after, too. And we're looking at a new book they have. We went off track there for a second. The book is called Final Exams, True Crime Cases from CYRIL WECHT. And also co-author, of course, is Donna Kaufman. www.nightfrightshow.com. Just click on tonight's guest book cover. We'll take you to a place where you can order the book from the comfort of your own home. Donna, when you covered the OJ Simpson case, you did some groundbreaking work there. Looking back on that, is there anything that you wrote about at that time that has it changed your perspective at all? Has time changed your perspective at all?
Well, that case was a life changer for me, because I was happily employed as a TV comedy writer, and I went to clean out my desk from the Arsenio show after he quit his show the first time, and I thought, well, okay, I'll come back and look at a tape. I stuck it in a tape and hit record. It was the day of the slow-speed chase. But I didn't know that at the time. All I knew was he was going to give himself up to authorities, and I knew that he was a batterer. And that week, which was when the bodies were found, knowing his background as a domestic violence perpetrator, I joined the internet, and I had to pick a screen name, and so I thought, okay, well, I'll just make it OJ's guilty, and then I thought, well, if he's not guilty, I'll have to change that. Okay, well, all these years later, that's still my screen name, so there's one answer. But the other thing is, I did come home and I watched the slow speed chase, and I went, holy moly, I got to be a part of this team that's going to certainly investigate this and go forward to a trial. And I worked on the National Enquirer team, and it just whetted my appetite. And slowly I stopped writing comedy, and I did do Mad TV, which was a series for a while. And then I kind of got out of comedy and went full bore into true crime. And I don't regret it at all. I mean, I'm grateful for OJ for giving me that career change, but I'm also glad he's behind bars now. I wish he had been, 20 years ago. But I'm not happy with why he's behind bars now. I think that was just a really horrible miscarriage of justice. But that's another story. But anyway, so that's my rambling for why I do what I do.
Dr. Wecht, do you feel the same way about OJ?
Well, I definitely very strongly agree with Donna's last statement. You don't impose a penalty, as that judge in Nevada did, for the alleged crime that he had committed of such a magnitude, because she was playing to whichever crowd she was reaching out for, because you feel that the verdict in the first case was wrong. That is definitely a travesty of justice, very, very unfair. With regard to the first trial, I think that the prosecution did a poor job. They did some significant blunders. The glove was perhaps the greatest blunder of all. A glove, a kid knows that a glove that is wet and dries is going to shrink. For them to have put the glove on, Johnny Cochran followed so quickly on, it doesn't fit, you must acquit. And to put Mark Furman on. Mark Furman wasn't needed in the civil trial, he wasn't needed in the criminal trial, because the prosecution, knew it was clear on Furman's record, not a matter of speculation, conjecture, or unfair comments that had been never proven. It was shown that he had used the N-word. Well, how can you take somebody as your key witness, and he was their key witness, put him on the stand when you have a jury of 9 African Americans, and you're going to have it come out that this guy, upon whom your case rests to a very great extent, has used the N-word. So that's it. Not a matter of whether whether you believe OJ was guilty or not. In the United States, in Canada, you have fair trials, and you got to prove your case, and you go before a jury, and they blundered badly. Those are my thoughts.
May I add one other thing about how the prosecution blew it? The prosecution chose not to call a woman named Jill Shively, who was on the road that night after the murders and got almost run down by she was in her car, but she was almost knocked off the road by OJ Simpson in his Bronco fleeing the scene of the murders. And she sold her story because there were some months between when the murders occurred and when the trial happened. And during that time, she took $4,000, I believe it was, from a magazine and a TV tabloid show. And Marcia Clark thought, oh, well, her testimony is tainted, we're not calling her. Well, she's an important witness. And that is that's the the kind of thinking that no longer exists. Now, somebody would be called to the stand, and they would be and the prosecution would say, "And you took money for your story, didn't you?" "Yes, I did. I took $4,000 from this and that." "Okay, but were you lying?" "No, I was not lying." And the testimony would be valid. So we lost a very key witness who has never wavered in what she said she saw that night. The other thing is there was a film that OJ had just made a movie called Frogman, and he played a Navy SEAL assassin, and this was a pilot for NBC, and one of the key scenes has him dressed in black with the same kind of hat or head covering that was found later after the murders, and he sneaks up behind somebody, and with a knife he slits the person's throat, and all the blood gushes forward and doesn't cover him with blood because he's standing behind the victim. I mean, that is an absolute blueprint for what he did, and they chose not to show that footage to the jury. Maybe it would have made a difference, maybe it wouldn't have, but to exclude that footage, and that film, by the way, has been in police lockup ever since, has never been seen by the public. So two things where I think besides what Dr. Wecht just said, where the prosecution blew it.
Folks, www.nightfrightshow.com. The book is called Final Exams, True Crime Cases from CYRIL WECHT, and it's written also by Donna Kaufman. Both, we are blessed tonight, folks. Both are our guests tonight. And we are taking phone calls tonight, folks. If you're out there, you can Skype us at Brent Holland Show. And the little geographic location will come up, Kingston, Canada. So not to be mistaken with Jamaica, although sometimes I wish I was there. Let's go to one of the 4 cases that are in the book. And this one really touched my heart. This has a big Canadian connection. And it's called Hell Hath No Fury. And just let me read this for a second, folks. Well, I'll explain it after, how it changed Canadian law. Could you just give a brief synopsis of that, Dr. Wecht?
Is this the Bagby case?
Yes, it is.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, why don't you let Donna? She's good, Donna. Why don't you start it off? Go ahead.
Okay. Well, this is first of all, let me just say that in this book we have 4 different cases, all of which Dr. Wecht worked on to one degree or another in his role as a forensic examiner or forensic pathologist, which is the same as medical examiner, and it's somebody who cuts open a dead body and figures out what happened. And in the case of in the cases that we write about, they are all deemed homicides, and he covers from when the body is found through any eventual court hearing, and Dr. Wecht's testimony can send somebody to death row or get a wrongly convicted person off death row. That's how important the testimony is of a forensic pathologist. So our book has Final Exams, has 4 cases, and the 4th case is one from the Pittsburgh area. It was a young doctor who basically, this was his first job, 28-year-old Andrew Bagby. His bullet-ridden body was found in a park. Dr. Wecht did the autopsy. It became clear very early on that this was a homicide at the hands of his girlfriend, who was also a physician, and when it looked like she was going to be arrested, she fled to Canada, Newfoundland, and where she was a citizen, and they protected her. And then during the trial motions to try to get her to return to the United States, she announced that she was pregnant. And the parents of Andrew Bagby only had one child, and now he was dead. And now they had a grandchild who was to be born, and they had to make nice with the woman who killed their only son so they would have some chance of having a relationship with their only living kin. So that's the story in a nutshell, and it is absolutely a painful story. And the good part is, if you can call it good, is that these grandparents, what they did to fight the system was extraordinary, and they did prevail. But the story is I'm not going to give away what happened, but it is quite an emotional story. There's never been anything like this.
Very, very bizarre ending.
Please.
And back to the point about knowing who had shot him. This woman physician, his lady friend, the romance apparently being broken up by him, she had driven all the way from Iowa, I believe it was Iowa, and if she had not used tolls, then, just gotten off the major highways, the pay-as-you-go tolls, they might have gotten around to thinking about her, but who knows, driving back and forth like that, straight through, if she wasn't on duty and she wasn't missed, and she was at home and nobody could prove otherwise. So very interesting sometimes about how a crime is solved.
Right. The forensics are always something that we hit on in our storytelling, and in this case, it's an example of a woman who's so smart. She was a physician, but she didn't know about forensics, and she didn't know to turn off your cell phone, because the cell phone tracked her movements as she said, "Oh, I wasn't even there." Well, yes, you were. So the case was solved very quickly, but because of the problem with Canada, justice was not rapid there.
I should explain that, folks. Indeed, Canada does not have the death penalty. We haven't had it, I think, since 1972. For better, for worse. In some cases, I think it's for worse. When I look down the street at the maximum penitentiary here in Kingston, where a lot of the wackos, just god-awful serial killers and rapists and child abusers were housed. Perhaps, what is it, 20 cents for a bullet? That's all I'm going to say. We haven't had the death penalty since 72. So because of that, we are very hesitant to extradite, if you will, send somebody abroad, say to Saudi Arabia, where they could be beheaded. It works a little bit different with the United States because it's state by state, but Canada looks at all the various cases, and they try to make a judgment, some kind of judgment based on the case. If they feel that no, they may be killed in the end, well, then they just won't send them. So, yeah, it's a bit of a stickler for sure. When you're dealing with the States, you're not dealing with Saudi Arabia, so we have to bear that in mind too. And no offense, well, yeah, a little bit of offense to Saudi Arabia, where they treat their women like chattel. It's not Israel, let's put it that way, folks. Now, I just want to tell you that because as a result of this case, there was something that came out that changed Canadian Criminal Code on October 23rd, 2009. It was actually called Zachary's Bill, named after the little guy. And the bill is C-464. Essentially, the bill enables the courts to refuse anyone bail that's accused of a serious crime in the name of protecting their children. So there's a case, you see, folks, where the law has changed. Now, Dr. Wecht, has that happened a lot with you, where you've investigated something and, say, police procedures have changed? Procedures and how forensics are carried out has changed?
Well, yes. You've already pointed out this thing with regard to capital punishment. Insofar as countries are concerned, it doesn't exist down here in the States, to my knowledge. somebody can be extradited from one state to another, even though the state in which they have been found does not have the death penalty, and the state to which they would be returned does have a death penalty. With regard to forensics, there are things that have changed. Certainly, the most dramatic change, insofar as cold cases are concerned, insofar as reversals, insofar as proving that a case has occurred. I would say that DNA certainly has been the most revolutionary thing, no question about it. First used in England about 1984, and then picked up by the FBI around 88, 89, and applied since that time, cellular DNA. Otherwise, I would say the changes and things that have occurred are really due largely to a greater focusing on sophisticated forensic scientific techniques, most of which did exist before with some technological advancements, but because of the OJ Simpson case, the John Benet Ramsey case, and frankly, probably because of the fictional programs also, there has been increased application, utilization of forensic scientific techniques that were extant, but which were not handled in the same diligent fashion that we find them being applied today.
Fair enough. Folks, the book is called Final Exams, True Crime Cases from CYRIL WECHT, and also co-authored by Donna Kaufman. Easy way to get it is always www.nightfrightshow.com. Now, I'm just wondering here, as I'm going over some of the questions and notes I had for you, one thing comes to mind that I hadn't written down, and that is very often, Donna, you go to Dr. Wecht for a quote or for some information. Has it ever happened that he has come to you?
Well, I don't know what expertise I have that, I mean, you know, he will come to me and say, here's a case we really ought to hit on in our next book. And I listen very carefully. Let me just back up and say, Dr. Wecht does on an average day, 3 autopsies a day.
Oh, good God.
That's 18,000.
No, you're a little high. You're a little high. No, you're high.
What, is my red eyes that are giving me away?
No. No, I do enough, over 400 a year of my own, not counting others that I review. But anyway, that's a big load. But go ahead,
Well,
Don. I'm sorry.
It's 18,000 plus autopsies that he has personally done, and he has consulted on another 38,000 plus cases. So I have plenty of cases to choose from, and so he'll say to me, oh, here's a really good one we should include in a future book. And there are a number of variables I look at. Each book, and this is our third, has to do with, sometimes he works on the prosecution, sometimes he works on the defense. So I want both of those represented in a book, and I want different causes and manners of death, and Dr. Wecht can describe the difference of those two words, which are very important. And I'd like to have different parts of the country or the world represented, and sometimes we'll write about famous people. We've written about Michael Jackson, Anna Nicole Smith, in books, Casey Anthony, Drew Peterson, Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones. So sometimes these are cases that people know a great deal about, but we go in and find things that they don't know about. And then sometimes they're just, like the Bagby case, just emotionally gut-wrenching, and it just need to be included in there because there are heroes that we find in the storytelling that we want to give a little pat on the back to. So that's how he consults me and encourages me to choose the stories. And I'm the one who has to be with each chapter for several months as I'm gathering material. So it has to be something that rises to that level where we have photos and we have background, family family involvement, and the family involvement is so critical because these people very often don't know the full stories of what happened, and we're really happy to be able to translate that to them. So sometimes, in the case of the one of the chapters in the book is about Jessica Lunsford, which we can talk about later, but that's one where I brought Dr. Wecht into it. But basically these are his stories, and he's worked on these cases from when the body is recovered through whatever court action, and we also find that even a court verdict is not necessarily the end of the story. One of our cases is having a new trial, so these things have a life of their own, and then there are civil trials that come out of them, and someone is paroled, and they never stop. They just never stop, and so. And neither does the science behind them. Just like Dr. Wecht was talking about DNA being purified and being used in court cases, that whole discipline has changed. And one of our cases is very makes that important point. And and that's true. I mean, if you're looking at fingerprints, even something as prosaic as fingerprint evidence is being questioned by prominent and competent defense attorneys, and so laboratories have to really know what they're doing and really have high standards if they're expected to have their representatives put somebody to death or on trial.
You must be
clairvoyant. These things are living, breathing.
You got to be clairvoyant, Donna, because I was just about to bring up Jessica Lunsford's story. Now, what is disturbing to me, folks, with all of these stories is when it comes down to kids, and I think of John Bennett Ramsey, of course. Dr. Wecht, when you look at what is happening to children today, is it on the increase? Is there some kind of repeating pattern in the psyche that has human beings go after kids like never before?
I don't know whether there has been a forensic epidemiological study done and whether one could be done in terms of determining whether or not there is something cyclical, whether or not something in recent years because of the depersonalization of society, the greater mobility of society, etc., whether there are more crimes against children than there were before. And the reason that cannot be done, in my opinion, is because going back, and I'm not talking about the ancient past, just go back several decades, let alone a century or two. There was no television. There were no people like you, Brent, with these kinds of programs. There were no real investigative reporters, and of course, society was nowhere near as advanced in many other ways. What went on then with children was a different matter. Also, things were looked at differently. I don't want to digress, but look at the situation now involving the Minnesota Viking ball player who whipped his kid. I can tell you where I went to school in my neighborhood. Kids were whipped with a paddle strong. There was one particular teacher, was the gym teacher, and when you were bad, you were sent to him, and you lined up, you bent over, you held your crotch, and he whacked you hard. And I knew where I grew up, mostly kids of first-generation Americans, immigrants, some of the ethnic families from different parts of Europe, they whopped their kids. So anyway, coming back to this, but let me comment as a parent, as a grandparent, as a forensic pathologist, as somebody who's been involved in government and society in many other ways, and that is that it is absolutely amazing that people commit these acts of sheer savagery, of barbarity directed toward children. It's inexplicable. How do you how do you try to understand these things from a moral, ethical standpoint in countries like yours and ours, and so on. And of course, what do we know? I'm not talking about the Islamic terrorism. We do know about that, and the killing of innocent children because they're Christians or Kurds or Yazidis. We do know that. But what's going on in Africa, in many countries of Asia and so on, toward children. So I think that, it's a problem. It's going to remain so, and this is not to be indifferent to attacks on other people, too. Worse for children in our eyes, in our minds, in my thoughts as I do an autopsy, but that doesn't mean that the killing of an innocent person, even an adult male, he was a human being too. Well, that's the nature of the business, and you can get all the sociologists, psychologists, psychiatrists, theologians, moralists, ethicists, political observers, and news media people in the world, bring them together, and you could have discussions ad infinitum. You're not going to come up with an answer. Human beings are beasts. We're animals. And in fact, we do some things that you don't find in the animal world.
Right. That's for sure.
That's pretty scary. How do you deal with that when you're writing a book like this? I mean, I just finished my own book on the Kennedy assassination, and well, I guess you guys don't know, I was very blessed. I got to interview Ted Sorensen twice and spend an afternoon with him in his Manhattan apartment just prior to him dying. And God must have tapped me on the shoulder on the way to his place and said, go back, get your video camera, because it turned out to be his last interview.
Wow.
And
we'll have to talk about
absolutely.
JFK another time,
Yeah, he virtually changed my life. But I guess what I'm going to say is when I was engulfed in writing the book, when it came to the death of the president, it's very upsetting to look at these pictures. Now, you look at these pictures every day, you're engulfed in it, and as well as you, Donna, because you're writing the book. So, of course, when you're doing your research, you also have to indulge in this type of barbarity. That's the only word I can. How do you stay sane, Donna?
Well, from my Donna, you good. From my standpoint, people often ask. I just want to say that I see what you see, and I smell what you smell, and so you don't become insensitive. No way do you become immunized. There's no way that you develop a tolerance or habituation to these things. But you deal with it. It's and you, in some ways, you comfort yourself by knowing what you're doing is going to contribute really to civil and criminal justice. It's going to assuage anxiety, allay apprehension. It's going to hopefully lead to the punishment of the guilty, the exoneration of the innocent, etc. And I'm not just waving flags here. I mean, these are the things collectively, when you think of what forensic pathologists and other forensic scientists do every day somewhere in Canada, United States, etc., put it all together and just think what the justice system would be without that kind of scientific input.
Donna? How do you stay sane?
Well, our books, as I said, this is our third book, and every one of them has a case about a child who was sexually abused and a homicide victim. And a lot of true crime authors just won't touch that. And I have kind of embraced that as a necessary evil in each of our books because I want people to be aware of how these crimes occur, how society can protect itself against these white sharks of the streets.
Have you got some
these
suggestions?
Killer sharks
how parents
that are after our children.
Have you got some suggestions how parents could protect their kids that they might
well,
not be aware of?
a lot of the cases, it's just you do everything you can, and it still happens. In this case of Jessica Lunsford, and in our first book, A Question of Murder, which had to do with Danielle Van Dam, predators came into the home while the family and the dog was there, took the child out, and got in and out of the house with no difficulty. And they, in one case, it was a stranger, and one was someone who was a neighbor. So how is that possible? You can't protect against that, but you can find out how parents become advocates when they are thrust into this horrible world of becoming a victim, and how they get through it. A lot of times families break up and point fingers at each other, and when there's another perpetrator who did this. So this is something that I'm just committed to telling these stories, because I get so angry. Our second book actually also has a case like this, where a child was just playing and just kidnapped off the street and raped and killed. These are things that I see all the time. I mean, maybe once a day I see a new case of this nature, and it is repelling. And you can look at this and wonder if there's a connection to the internet and pornography and child porn, and I think a good argument could be made about that. As Dr. Wecht said, the desensitization of society is just a whole new spectrum of crimes that are occurring, and it creates a whole new spectrum of laws and trying to legislate what we can do to ensure better safety, and so there are a lot of just different elements that come from this. But at the core of it, there's a dead child, and that's just a horrible thing. It's just a terrible thing that I think we're seeing more of, or at least there are more reports of this now.
Dr. Wecht, have you ever done any, I was going to say research, have you ever investigated a child committing murder on another child?
Yes, I've had some cases over the years, not many, because, Brent, those cases are usually then handled, obviously, by the court system. I'm not sure about Canada, but probably it's the same as the United States. You may even be more humanitarian and benevolent than we are in that regard. So when a child of tender years, and that varies, it's not as rigid as it used to be under English common law majority. Now you can convict a child of murder. I've seen a child, 12, 13 children convicted of murder. But usually, if they're under 13, 14, things are worked out with the court. And I think below 12, I don't know of any child where it's really been pursued. This doesn't mean that they won't be charged with murder. It doesn't mean that they won't be sentenced to juvenile court. But they'll go to juvenile court, and there's not going to be a jury trial sending them to prison for the rest of their life. As a matter of fact, there's a recent U.S. Supreme Court decision which holds that has to do with that, whether a child can be sentenced, wherein the sentence lingers on into adulthood and continues, and that decision essentially said no. So you don't really, I mean, but have I seen autopsies in which a child has killed another child? Yes, sometimes with guns in our great United States of America, where everybody is permitted to own a gun. So guns are around the house. A kid gets a gun, and they're playing with it, and the gun goes off. Other cases, kids are doing things that are mischievous, sometimes even malicious, malevolent, and so on. I remember a great movie from a long time ago, I bet you Don will remember it, called Bad Seed, in which there was this beautiful little blonde girl that went on, that was a murderess from early on. So you do have kids that do these things, and then you get into an argument or a discussion, I shouldn't say, an argument, more of a discussion with a pediatric adolescent psychiatrist. Is a child of tender years, 8, 9, 10, 11, is such a child capable of premeditated, deliberate murder, which would be first-degree murder, and I believe also in yours, and that's a question for another day. Suffice it to say that there are some cases in which a kid intends to harm. Now, do they understand the meaning of death? Do they understand the irreversibility of death? So you go on and on. But yes, children do kill children, and I've had such cases over the years, but not that often. More often, it's, of course, adults in one capacity or another. And let me say, turn that coin over, too. There are cases in which people are falsely accused. There are cases from a pathological standpoint where charges are made. One of the big things in this country is shaken baby syndrome, which your country, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the Canadian Medical Society, have labeled as junk science, and I agree with the Canadians that there's no such pure thing as shaken baby. They've changed, in fact, the language in the United States now. It's called shaken baby syndrome with impact or abusive head trauma. So I and some of my colleagues who held out on the shaken baby syndrome decades ago and past years have prevailed. But there are cases which are overdiagnosed, and especially, again, I'm talking about the United States, I can't speak for Canada, where the pediatricians now are dealing with, I think, a collective sense of guilt passed on from previous generations of pediatricians, in some cases their own mentors, their teachers, the people that they highly respected, under whom they trained. Because look at the battered child syndrome. Battered child syndrome was not recognized until the early 1960s. Well, just think, Brent, gee, my God, we're talking about society. There were no battered children until the early 1960s. Do you realize what that means? Do you realize, think about the cases that were missed until this entity was diagnosed by Kemp and others, 50-some years ago? So now you bring a kid into the emergency room in the United States of America with a fracture or an injury or something. And I can tell you from my own children, one of them's a judge, one's a neurosurgeon, one's an OB-GYN, one's an academician, forensic science program director. I can tell you from them, you walk into the emergency room with a kid, and that kid has an injury, you are guilty. You have caused, directly, indirectly, that injury until proven otherwise in their eyes. So I just wanted to turn that coin over, too. You got to be careful in these cases, and I've had a lot of fascinating cases like that.
You've both been in depth, up front, up face-to-face with evil, I would say. Don, I'm going to start with you, but I'd like to get Dr. Wecht's answer after. What is the scariest thing that you've come across?
Wow. Let me just add to what Dr. Wecht was getting at with the child cases. And you and your audience have probably heard of the Slender Man phenomenon.
Yes. What's going on? That's what I was trying to get at. Yeah.
Young adult series of books, and I guess they're sort of novel, photo novels or picture novels, about a character who encourages young girls to kill people. And there were three 12-year-old girls, maybe one was 13, and in the States, and two of them plotted to kill the third one and stabbed her 19 times because Slender Man would have approved of them doing this. The fictional character would have approved of them killing their best friend, but the girl didn't die. She actually recovered. She's back in school, and she's now the question is there going to be a trial? And I get very frustrated because sometimes the doors close around a child perpetrator, and we don't get to see how this would play out in a court. in the case of the two perpetrators here, they were both found mentally defective and unable to be tried. So they will be dealt with in the mental health system, which may be exactly where they should be. One of the sets of parents and the main perpetrator are very goth kinds of people, and I know goths, and I come from the punk rock music world, so I'm not shocked by anything. But these parents really raised their daughter as if they were in the Addams Family, and you see them in court showing up with multiple piercings in their faces and tattoos on their, everywhere, and there's nothing wrong with that. But did that make for a child who would have trouble telling the difference between fiction and non, and having a sense of reality? This girl really believed that this evil character, Slender Man, was telling her to do this. And of course, it sort of reminds you of Son of Sam, where David Berkowitz, a killer in New York, said that a dog of a neighbor, Sam, was telling him to kill people. So, the mental illness quotient, we're seeing child killers being diagnosed as schizophrenic at age 12. Usually that is something that diagnosis would come much later, around early adulthood or late teens at least. But now we're seeing that level change, and it's becoming much, much earlier. And then there was a second Slender Man attempted murder, where a girl was certain that Slender Man wanted her to kill her mother and burn down their house. And that one is yet to be dealt with. But this is a strange world we're living in now, where kids don't seem to be able to tell the difference, or they don't care. The callousness of these two girls was just off the map. They absolutely confessed and said they wanted to see her die, and this is their best friend. So
there's no empathy.
Scary. That's a scary thing to me.
That terrifies me as well, and that's what I was getting at. Dr. Wecht, how about yourself, sir?
Well, you mean in terms of what has been the greatest form of evil, or
what scares you to death the most?
Scares me? Well, what scares me, standing back and looking at the broader picture, and not just one case, and not just today or yesterday, but looking at the broader picture. We're in the year 2014. Think of what has happened technologically. Think of what we're doing. People landing on the moon. Think of everything with the equipment. You can see what everybody's doing and know where everybody is. And so you have all of these things happening, and at the same time, look at what is going on in the world. Again, I don't want to digress, but there's something wrong. I just wish. I know I can't live forever, and I don't want to live forever. I wish there was some way that at least once every decade or two, that after I die, I would be able just to have a brief day, an hour to read top newspapers, just to see what's going on in the world. It's very disturbing when you think of what's happening around the world. And I don't want to digress, but where is our sense of human decency? Where's civilization going? We have billions of dollars being spent every week in warfare somewhere or other around the world collectively, and yet in Africa with the Ebola vaccine, it would take just a fraction of that amount of money to be able to control that by establishing medical centers and getting in appropriate medical personnel. So I'm just giving that as an example of our overall society. We are not moving along in parallel symmetrical fashion with what is happening technologically. Now that leads then to a question: does technology, does all of this business, including, by the way, television and all of these fictional stories and everything that is presented and so on, and the kinds of things, Donna talking about Slender Man and so on. Well, there was no way in the world, going back some decades or so, for Slender Man to have been around. There was no television. You didn't have the means of disseminating that kind of information so easily with such great facility, did you? So it's fascinating to think of what has technology done to contribute to the diminution of the advancement of society, the worsening of civilization. Ironically, paradoxically, have the advancements of a technological nature contributed to the demoralization and the dehumanization of society? There's something to think about.
We're coming up to break right now, folks, but I just want to tell you we're speaking with Dr. CYRIL WECHT, and fans of the show will know who he is for sure, and his co-author, Donna Kaufman. The book is called Final Exams, I'll get this together yet, folks. Final Exams, True Crime Cases from CYRIL WECHT with co-author Donna Kaufman, www.nightfrightshow.com. Stick with us. The music's going to start any second now for 6
Brent,
minutes.
Brent, may I say good night to you and your listeners? I have a commitment with some attorneys on a call, but Donna's going to be with you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Dr. Wecht.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
We'll be back in a few moments with Donna Kaufman. Stick with us, folks. See you in 6 minutes. Stick around there, my friend Donna. See you in 6 minutes. Quick shout out to Kelly Loeb. Thank you, Kelly, for all that you do, keeping the website up and doing all the volunteer work you do for this show. Thank you so much, my friend. Folks, get the coffee going, get the tea going, get a beverage of your choice going, settle back, relax. There's plenty of time left. We have Donna Kaufman with us tonight. She's co-written a book with Dr. CYRIL WECHT, who was here in the first hour, but we're going to continue with Donna. Dr. CYRIL WECHT had to leave. The book is called Final Exams, True Crime Cases from CYRIL WECHT with co-author Donna Kaufman. www.nightfrightshow.com. Just click on the book cover there. That'll take you right to a spot where you can order the book from the comfort of your own home. And it's time I have to plug my book again. Otherwise, my publisher charges me for that. I'm just kidding. But she says, Brent, plug your book. So here we go. I've written a book. It's called The JFK Assassination from the Oval Office to Dealey Plaza. It's got a whole list of first-person witnesses that were involved with the assassination, including Ted Sorensen, who was JFK's speechwriter and closest aide. He was the person John F. Kennedy tasked to write that letter to get Khrushchev to back down and take the missiles out of Cuba. He also confirmed to me, and you'll see this in the book, that it was a conspiracy. And that's something that has never come from the inner circle of the Kennedy team before. So you can get that at www.nightfrightshow.com as well. First-person witnesses include Abraham Bolden, the first African-American Secret Service agent, Beverly Oliver, who was the Babushka lady. She knew Jack Ruby, and she was in Dealey Plaza that day. James Tague, who was the third person wounded in Dealey Plaza, and also Dr. Robert McClelland, who worked on JFK, and he tells the true story of the behind the scenes trying to resuscitate the stricken president and how Jackie reacted in Trauma Room 1. So that, again, is available for you to get. Also, there are 2 companion DVD documentaries that you can order online. One is on Dr. Robert McClelland. It's called First Person Witnesses, Beverly Oliver and James Tague. And the other is a full documentary, feature film documentary, on Abraham Bolden, the first African-American Secret Service agent handpicked by JFK. www.nightfrightshow.com. Let's go back to Donna right away. Donna, what an explosive and incredible man Dr. White is. Now, how did you guys...
Yes.
Now, I've got to watch my language here because I was in Starbucks the other day, and I made a big error, folks. I had my laptop with me, and I had it on the table, and I said to the young lady behind the counter, I said, "Here, let me move my junk down to the other end to give you room." Well, she looked at me like I was from Mars. Now, junk apparently has a whole new meaning now. Who knew? They should put warning signs up for old farts like me.
Showing your junk in Starbucks, that could get you some serious attention or a movie contract here in Los Angeles.
But the point I was going to make, there's another word that has changed meaning, folks. And that word is hooking up. It's two words, actually. I asked another young lady at Starbucks if she was hooking up with her boyfriend that night to go see a movie. And again, she looked at me like I was from Mars. So I'm quite well known now at Starbucks as the old fart that doesn't know the language. Hooking up has a whole new connotation. How did you guys come to meet each other?
Well, we don't hook up. He's happily married, and there's a whole country between us. Well, after I was working on the OJ case, I went into other true crime cases, including JonBenet Ramsey, and I would find that I was most interested in the forensic and behavioral aspects of these cases, and the perpetrators, the suspects, the victims, the players around each of them. And so I would, when I was doing articles for various newspapers and magazines, I would want to have some science behind the theories I was the theories that I would promote. So I would call Dr. Wecht for his opinions, and he was excellent about breaking down the medicalese and the legalese into bite-sized pieces that even, I could understand and readers could understand. And I thought, well, this is why this guy is so effective in speaking to juries, because he really puts it into plain vernacular. So that's how we started. I would call him for his opinion on various cases, and I've worked on, hundreds or 1,000 different cases. I don't even count them anymore because they're constantly coming and going. And many, many times I've called upon Dr. Wecht, and then at a certain point, I started going to conferences. This is even before the TV show CSI or Criminal Minds were on the air, and I would go to these forensics conventions where I was like a kid in a candy store, really learning what other people go to school for, advanced degrees for. I was just embracing and learning all these various disciplines. And at the time, because there wasn't a lot of pats on the back for the scientists doing these kinds of cases, I was really welcomed into the fold, and I began to become familiar there, and I would also use the various contacts I made to flesh out my stories, and we would talk other cases, and it was just a tremendously rich environment of science and law and all the disciplines, from fibers to DNA to fingerprints to question documents to blood to ballistics. All these things and toxicology, all these were new ideas to me, and I was learning from the very best people, not only in America, but from around the world, who would go to these forensics seminars and talk about, open cases and cases that they couldn't solve, that they needed help from their colleagues about. So I really embraced the whole thing, and I was very lucky to be exposed to all of this at a time when, when it was not getting a lot of attention. So now that there's CSI and Criminal Minds and Rizzoli and Isles and all of these TV shows on, and NCIS, and they're all, even to a certain degree, Law and Order, and they're all spawning sequels of their primary shows, SVU for Law and Order, and now NCIS from New Orleans, and all of these stories have the autopsy and the science as the Rosetta Stone. It's where you start telling the story. It's where you assess a crime. So all of that is new, and it sort of informs a jury as well, although we constantly have situations where a jury just doesn't understand. What do you mean it takes months to get DNA results? I thought it was like the time that, there's a commercial and you come back and you've got the DNA results. So that's kind of the CSI effect in the real world is, not realistic, but I think it's better to have informed people, and you just describe to them at the beginning, this is real, this is not fiction. And the reason I write nonfiction is because the twisted stories that we tell in our books, no Hollywood writer, of which I am one, I'm in the Screenwriters Guild, could concoct these kinds of insane plot twists as you see in real life.
Yes.
So it just constantly keeps me in a perpetual state of amazement and amusement.
Of how deep human beings can go and the depravity they're capable of. Did you cover the Michael Jackson death?
Yes, that is in our second book, and it's
Go ahead,
called,
plug that the title too. We'll talk about that.
Yeah, that is From Crime Scene to Courtroom, and that's the Casey Anthony story is in there, and Drew Peterson, and a couple of, I think there are several cases in there. But Michael Jackson, certainly, I live in Los Angeles. I saw what that did to our community. There was a time from when he was, our book talks about what led up to his death. And basically, he was a drug addict from 1984 forward. And his whole life in the last few years was dedicated to trying to find more drugs at a time when the United States system was limiting what doctors were able to prescribe to patients. And smart, wealthy people like Anna Nicole Smith and Michael Jackson knew that they would have to find vulnerable doctors to keep the drugs coming, and they would compromise the doctors, and why these doctors agreed to it is a whole nother thing. But, they would get their prescriptions under false names, and so we spend a lot of time talking about that. And with Michael Jackson, of course, there was the trial of his doctor who ended up going to jail for a short time for manslaughter, negligence, and so that's a very interesting case. And there was a point where they couldn't figure out where to bury him, so he was on ice, and that happened with Anna Nicole too. There were weeks, if not months, in between the death to when they were finally buried, when a secure place was found for their bodies to be interred. And during that time, other tests were done on the rapidly disintegrating body, because bodies do decompose even when they are in cold climes and the morgue drawers. There's still decomposition. So, we go into all of that. So you have in his background, was this doctor fairly charged with this crime that he was found guilty of, and why weren't other doctors in Michael Jackson's purview also charged? Our first book is called A Question of Murder, and that has the Anna Nicole Smith story, as well as her son, Dr. Wecht, got into it because the son died in the Bahamas shortly after Anne Nicole, like 3 days after she gave birth to her daughter.
Could I just ask you a couple of more questions about Michael? In 1984, he did the Victory Tour.
Mm-hmm.
And I, as a lighting designer, I have a lighting design degree, and I worked on that tour, and he seemed normal. Actually, the whole Jackson family treated the crew like royalty. I've never been treated
Wow.
like that before. And I'm just wondering if, when he burnt his hair and his face and that, if that's what led to the downward spiral and the attraction.
Absolutely was.
That was the
trigger. It can be all blamed upon that, the Pepsi commercial.
Yeah.
And you can see it on the internet where his hair catches fire because he's got product in his hair.
Sure.
And he doesn't realize for a while that his hair is burning, and it burned really the whole top of his scalp. If you can imagine putting a yarmulke on your head and having that amount of hair and scalp burned off, and the absolute horrendous pain that would produce, and it got him dependent on pills. In the case of both Anna Nicole and Michael, they would be the last people who would think of themselves as drug addicts. But prescription medications are the main cause of drug deaths. And Dr. Wecht would tell you, if he were here, that half of the patients that come across his morgue table these days are combined drug toxicity deaths. It's not, the junkies with the needles in their arms. It's the people with multiple pills in their systems and who are self-medicating and think, well, okay, I'll have a little alcohol, or I can't sleep, let me take painkillers on top of sleeping pills, on top of antidepressants, on top of cold medication, and all these things are combined, and people die.
Because Robin Williams, I think Michael started suffering from depression after that as well. I think that was a large part of his insomnia, big time.
Yeah, but you saw him at a point when he was, and I wish I had that exposure. I saw him in concerts, and I worked in the TV business, so I saw him a little there. But my gosh, when he was at his greatest, there was nobody who was close to him. The talent, the sheer amazing talent of this young man, it was just phenomenal.
It was just unbelievable. Now, I'm going to let a secret out of the bag that's probably not a secret, but at the time, Brooke Shields was visiting with him, and I'll use that word visiting in quotation marks. Yeah. So the pedophilia and all that stuff, I don't know if that's true or not, folks. I have no clue on that. That was long after, and I just don't know.
Well, they never had a sexual relationship. You must know that. She was a virgin until she was at Princeton, and it was really a concoction of her mother, Terry, who I was a friend of at a certain point in those even earlier years, and it was good PR for both of them to have this kind of red carpet connection, but it was very chaste, and yeah,
it was missed. Joan Bennett Brown, the other young girl, when you covered her.
JonBenet Ramsey.
Yes, thank you.
Dr. Wecht wrote a book about that with somebody else before we started working on it together, and his book is called Who Killed JonBenet Ramsey, and it still is an absolute must-read for anyone interested in this case. And but as a reporter, I probably have written more articles than any other single person on that case. Well, maybe there are a couple others who have the same kind of connection to the case as I do. But we will both state without a doubt that this is an inside job We don't know who did it, but if you read his book, he goes through the autopsy and interprets what this means, and unfortunately it never did go to trial because the two adults who were in the house never turned on each other, which is usually what breaks a case open. So it really is a strange set of circumstances, never to be repeated, one hopes, but definitely an interesting concoction that has, I don't know, that I think of JonBenet a lot. She would be 24 years old now, and she would be she would be doing what she wanted to be, perhaps a veterinarian already. Maybe she would be in the beauty pageant world, or through it already. Maybe she would have been a teacher or a violinist. She had so many interests. As a young girl, 6 years old when she died, she was a very interesting little girl. And part of that was her mom pushing her into lessons and the life that she lived as a baby beauty pageant winner, extreme costumes, but that was her mother's life as well. And all of the costumes that we've seen of JonBenet were based on costumes that Patsy, the mother, wore in various pageants as she was coming up. And she was Miss West Virginia at a time and a runner-up for Miss America. Her sister was also Miss West Virginia. So they had pageants in their blood. And that is an interesting world. I mean, that whole idea of baby beauty pageants was an eye-opener to a lot of people who never knew that world existed. But it not only exists and existed then in 1996 when she died, but it's probably become even more lucrative now.
We do to our children. Folks, the book is called Final Exams, True Crime Cases from Dr. CYRIL WECHT, with co-author Donna Kaufman. And we've got Donna for another, we still got a lot of time left, folks, if you're just joining us. She's all the way from Los Angeles, California. And we're just talking about the book and different cases that they've covered. Another book that they've written together, Crime Scene to Courtroom. And both of those books will be linked on www.nightfrightshow.com website.
And A Question of Murder as well, which was our first book. And that's
A Question of Murder. That will be there as well, folks. So you can get all three books with the click of a button and take you right to a place where you can order them. No worries. A Question of Murder. Now, you had also mentioned that you were thinking about bringing out a new book about the Kennedy assassination with Dr. Wecht.
Yes, we're deep into it.
Can you give us a little bit of a hint?
Yes, of course. Dr. Wecht has had a 50-year involvement in the case.
Yes.
And he, like all of us of a certain age, he was consulted. When the murder happened, he was a young pathologist and was just shocked. And for a period of time, there was no reason not to believe everything that the government was saying. They caught this guy, Lee Harvey Oswald, and they arrested him, and then what do you know? He was killed. As a child, when I was growing up, I saw Lee Harvey Oswald shot to death on my television. It was the first snuff film of my life. I think all of us grew up that week, not only from the assassination, but from seeing the perpetrator killed. And what a strange experience that was. And in fact, in America, there was such a pall over our lives and our world and our existence that it took the Beatles appearing on Ed Sullivan in 1964 to sort of shock the world back into smiling again. So, it was heady times back then. Anyway, Dr. Wecht didn't suspect that there was anything amiss with what he was hearing about the case until the Warren Commission report came out, which was several months after the assassination. And then the full
September
26
24th, by
volume.
the way, folks, is going to be the 50th anniversary of that.
Right,
And I
and so
should
our
also-
book, I don't know if our book will be, when it will be out, because I'm not really adhering to any firm release date, but it will be, like our current book, Final Exams, released on planetandrule.com, and it will be called 50 Years of Lies, because Dr. Wecht has 50 years of monitoring, and he's one of the prime voices that the media goes to when they want an alternative view to what the people who defend a one shooter have to say. And if you defend the one shooter, then you have to subscribe to the single bullet theory, which says one bullet went through in and out of JFK and in and out of Governor Connolly, who was also shot in the same car, and did all this damage, and then ended up on a gurney in Parkland Hospital. That just didn't happen. There's no way that you can look at the science behind the evidence and say that the story that the government is telling you is accurate. It's just lunacy. And if that is lunacy, if they're lying about that, then they're lying that there was a second shooter. So that case is one that's very important to us, and I think important to Americans and people around the world. And I can't wait until we can come back and discuss it. And I look forward to reading your book as well.
Thank you very much.
That's great, wonderful interviews you got there. So. Yes, as somebody who spends a great deal of every day still on DEALEY PLAZA or involved in this case, I'm just imbued with the assassination and the unfairness of it all. And you have to wonder what would have happened to the world, really, if that didn't happen. And also, 5 years later, Robert Kennedy's assassination, I wasn't living in Los Angeles, but I saw it on TV. I saw the aftermath on TV, and I was a young kid then, and I think, my gosh, I had campaigned for him, passing out flyers and stuff. And the lunacy of that case is you have a guy, Sirhan B. Sirhan, who's been in jail ever since his trial, and has never been allowed parole. He did have a gun that day. He did shoot his gun. There were 5 other people shot, and none of them mortally. But the shot that killed the senator who was running for president, Robert Kennedy, came from 2 inches behind his right ear, and Sirhan was never closer than 1.5 feet to Kennedy's front. So how did he do that? Well, he didn't do that. Obviously, there's a second shooter who has gone unpunished, and this is a case where really somebody could still be put on trial, whereas in the JFK case, no chance. But in the Robert Kennedy case, that is really still a viable open case. And you ask, how did he get convicted if that happened? Easy. They didn't present the autopsy at his trial. They did not have the medical examiner talk about the position of the bullet that killed him. Can you imagine any trial in any country, civilized country, not producing the one single most important document that would be the answer to the crime? They didn't admit it because they didn't want to open that door and talk about the guy who was behind him with the gun out.
I'm going to reveal something, folks, that's in my book, and because Donna's working on this right now, she just mentioned President Kennedy. and she also just mentioned Bobby Kennedy. And that is that there was a fella by the name of Jim Braden that was arrested moments after President Kennedy was killed in Dealey Plaza.
Oh, yes.
He had come out from a building called the Daltex building, which many people think some of the shots originated from. He was, I shouldn't say arrested, he was questioned and then released because he had just changed his name from Eugene Brading to Jim Braden. Anyways, as it turns out, this guy was a mafioso. He was a bag man. He had a list as long as your arm of convictions, mostly petty crimes, but he was definitely connected to the mob. So he was, get this, he was questioned because he had gone into the Daltex building under the presumption that he was looking for a telephone to call his mother, to tell his mother that the president had been assassinated. Anyways, if you can believe that. I just want
Well, absolutely an interesting character, somebody who's, if you read the book, I'm sure you have, by a friend of mine, a newsman here in Los Angeles, Pete Noyes. He wrote a book called Legacy of Doubt about Braden, and my gosh, the stuff that is, was ignored about this guy who definitely had some questions worth asking, and nobody wanted to go there with him. They had this all tied up. They had one guy they could lay it on and get a rubber stamp committee to say, yes, it's one guy, don't look anywhere else, ignore the man behind the curtain, and or in the case behind the red curtain. So for whatever their reasons, it was not properly investigated, and somebody like Braden definitely had some hinky involvement in what happened to him is just a real interesting story, and your book gets into that as well.
Yeah, and I just want to say, folks, with the night Bobby Kennedy was killed, Braden was also picked up in Los Angeles this time, only a few blocks from where Bobby Kennedy lay dying in his own blood, and was questioned once again. Coincidence? I leave that up to you to decide.
Right.
The book is called, the books we're talking about tonight, one is called Final Exams, True Crime Cases from CYRIL WECHT, with co-author Donna Kaufman, who's joined us tonight all the way from LA. And the other books are called Crime Scene to Courtroom, and the other one is...
From Crime Scene to Courtroom.
Oh, my apologies, From Crime Scene to Courtroom. And the other one is A Question of Murder. All three books can be found at www.nightfrightshow.com website. Get them all. I mean, this is a great time for this type of reading. It's dark out there. The days are getting much longer. Not in LA so much, because I don't think LA ever sleeps, kind of like New York. But certainly here in the North Country in Canada, put the fireplace on, kick back once the kids have got their baths and everything, or if you're a student going to university and you're up late studying and you need a break, nothing better than a good crime book like this.
Well, and I'm glad you said about students, because a lot of what we both try to do, Dr. Wecht and I, is break it down for a new generation. That as I'm writing the JFK book now,
that's what I did
I'm
too.
getting into all sorts of things that there are people who weren't born then who need to be educated about who was JFK, why it mattered,
that's right,
what led to so many suspects, what led to him being a target of disapproval by so many people, and so that's really interesting. But also in Pittsburgh, where Dr. Wecht was the coroner for 19 years, the medical examiner's building is named for him, and there's the CYRIL WECHT Institute of Forensic Science and Law at Duquesne University, where young people who are going for graduate degrees in forensic science and law really learn from the master about these cases and other cases and his views, and so if you're a student of these things, or you just like to read gripping mysteries, don't read fiction, read nonfiction. And this is, these are cinematic, strange stories that just couldn't be more accurate, and all the source information is right there. So it'll whet your appetite and keep you awake.
I think that's one of the reasons why I do the show, is for the students, and that's why I wrote my book.
Right.
By doing the show, many folks didn't even know who Jack Ruby was. And Jack Ruby, folks, for those of you that are joining us, he was the fellow that killed Lee Harvey Oswald, the purported assassin of JFK, only 3 days later. And
how did you come to write this book? What was your own involvement in the case, or your knowledge of it?
No, I'm kidding. It's a long story, but essentially, after I interviewed Ted Sorensen and he passed away, I realized that this was historical, and what he had told me confirming conspiracy, but not a coup d'etat, was historical, and I had to get it in print. And then I'd realized that I'd interview all these wonderful first-person witnesses, including your friend and mine, Sherry Feaster, who's a crime scene investigator, Mr. Chambers, who's a NASA physicist, and all the folks that were involved with the movie JFK, including Robert Groden. You're going to know all these names: Robert Groden,
right,
Jim Mars, Jim DiEugenio, Lisa Pease. I said, I'm going to put this together, because there's a whole
you're certainly
disconnect.
Dealing with the A-team there.
Thank you very much. And there's a big disconnect. I'll tell you. I tell this story very often on the show. I did a show on the 100th anniversary of the Titanic, and I had people, students, university students, writing me after saying, "Thank you so much for doing the show. We had no idea it was a real story." But the classic email, Donna, are you ready for this? And this is from a 20-year-old student going to university, not college, not high school. What happened to Jack? Which is the DiCaprio character, of course.
Right.
So I said, oh boy, have we got a disconnect. And I get chance, when I do a JFK show, I have to slow the guests down sometimes and explain what the Warren Commission was, what the Church Committee was, House Select Committee on Assassinations, and all these things. But if we want to engage the new generation, that's what we have to do.
Did Sorensen tell you that he wrote PT 109?
No, it wasn't PT 109. You're thinking of Courage. What the heck was it called?
Profiles in Courage.
Profiles in Courage.
Yeah.
He didn't write the whole thing. Sorensen's on record as saying that JFK wrote a lot of his speeches as well. I don't believe him. I think he was just carrying the torch forward. A lot of the stuff, after spending an afternoon with him, not just interviewing him, I realized JFK could not have been JFK. It was kind of like George Martin with the Beatles.
Right.
It wouldn't have been the same. They tried different producers and it just didn't work. Let's face it. There was only one Beatles, one George Martin. JFK would not have been JFK without Sorensen to write those magical words. Sorensen, of course, needed a JFK. I'm not saying JFK wasn't the greatest president in the world or anything like that without Sorensen, but I think what's defining now, and we're very able to see in terms of JFK, is that he had a magnificent team around him. I think Obama is of the same stature, and I'm going to catch hell for this, as JFK, but he hasn't got the team. Whereas JFK had the team. And it made a hell of a big difference, especially during the Cuban Missile Crisis, because Ted walks us through that. The darkest night of his life, he calls it. So, very, very interesting stuff. Let's get back to you.
Well, I appreciate hearing about that. It's interesting to know that JFK obsession is not just an American interest. So it certainly affected the world, and what happens to our president certainly, it means a lot. And we were living in a powder keg there then during this time with Russia Cuba and Vietnam. I mean, so many challenges. Very interesting times.
And it's funny how history's repeating itself right now in the Ukraine and the Middle East.
Yeah.
It's very, well, it's not funny, it's tragic, as the people become complacent, I think, sometimes. And I think that's dangerous as well.
And that was the most appropriate description of him, because everything he told the cops was just more fertilizer, if you will. But some of the things that came out at trial, he had been stringing on this girl, Amber, blonde, and she was, she didn't even know that he had a wife that was missing for a while. And then she saw him on TV, and her friend said, "Hey, that's the guy that's on TV looking for his wife." So then she became sympathetic to, "Oh, you poor dear," So Scott, at one point on a New Year's Eve, he called her and said, "I have to go on business to Europe, and I'll call you from Europe." So he calls her and he says, "Oh, I'm in Copenhagen. I twisted my leg on the cobblestone walk there, and but it's wonderful. I'm enjoying all the food of Copenhagen, and it's just great, and I can't wait to come back here with you." And then a dog would start barking, and he said, "Oh, the hotel I'm in, this crazy dog won't shut up, dog." And so he says, "Well, I have to go." So then the next day he calls her from Paris, and he's talking about, "Oh, I had crepes here, I went to the Eiffel Tower, and I can't wait to bring you here, and we'll have a wonderful romantic time. And this restaurant that I found, it's just great." And then this dog starts barking, and it's the same dog that was barking in Copenhagen, and he's pretending that's not. He said, "Oh, but they have a problem with dogs here, Well, it turns out that he was calling from his home in Modesto, just 90 miles from where she was, and it was his dog saying, "Amber, run for your life. He killed Lacey. You're next." I mean, I don't know his dog was really saying that, but that was his dog that Lacey had been taking for a walk right before she went missing. And I always thought that the dog was just trying to warn the next potential victim away from this guy. But it was pretty funny. I mean, the arrogance of this guy making up these crazy concoctions to make himself grandiose, and he is just typical psychopathic behavior.
By the way, folks, I'm broadcasting from Kingston. I'd mentioned the penitentiary before, the maximum security penitentiary. It was the former home of the Barbie and Ken killers. They used to live just down the street from where I am right now. So.
Oh, wow. Yes, that's
Barbie's
a great
out, by
case.
the way. Barbie's free.
Yeah, she's free, and everyone
kids.
knows her new name, and she can't really hide. But I think she's got 3 children now, so she's got a quality of life that she doesn't deserve, but she, that's the thing with court cases. Sometimes you have to make a deal with the devil. And when Carla Homolka was found guilty, and she turned on Paul Bernardo, her husband, for the series. I mean, he was just a horrible rapist and even a rapist killer. They got off on doing this together, and her testimony helped put him behind bars forever. But it turned out that after a while, they found these audio recordings of her showing that she wasn't just a passive abused woman who was, not in favor of him killing these people. She was definitely a player in all of this and enjoying the experience. So to see that she's released on the public, and even if she's cleaned up her act, we can't forget who she really is. That's a great case to read about.
Yeah, that's just terrifying. Little tip for the young students that are out there. a lot of them are budding readers. When you come across a story, how do you discern from one to the next what to include in a book?
Well, when we cast our books for stories, again, it's like, I got to make sure that Dr. Wecht's work in it for the defense is represented, as well as his interest for the prosecution, and or if it's a civil case, So what is the case? The cases that don't interest me generally are gunshots, because there's not a lot of premeditation, and I like that premeditation.
Okay.
I describe our work together as he's the CSI, the evidence man, and the body man, and the autopsy guy. I'm the behavioral background person. I'm the criminal mind.
Are you Mark Harmon and
half of
he's
it.
Ducky? Is that what you're trying to tell me?
Say that again?
Are you Mark Harmon and he's Ducky?
You know what? I don't watch that show, but it's Criminal Minds is the one with the FBI profilers, and that's I was trained by the best person in that, the guy who started that whole business. So, but we try to have a variety of causes of death and manners of death, and different court systems, and different outcomes, and also, what are the things that show new science, and what have we learned on these cases? So that's what I find interesting.
We're going to have to start to wrap up, but I want to thank both you and Dr. Wecht for coming on the show. Folks, our guest tonight has been Dr. Wecht in the first hour, CYRIL Wecht. Donna Kaufman, there's the darn music, www.nightfrightshow.com. There you will find 3 book covers. Click on all 3 book covers. That'll take you right to a spot where you can get your great books. Thank you so much, Donna.
Thank you, Brent. I look forward to speaking to you on JFK.
Absolutely. Take care, my friend. Bye.